Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and this is a channel about RTS games. In this video, I want to elaborate on something I touched on in my review of Tooth and Tail: how RTS games die. This is sort of a weird subject to tackle, and all of the evidence I have for my theory is anecdotal, based on my own experiences playing lesser-known RTS games. But I seem to have witnessed the same pattern play itself out enough times to at least posit a theory on how it tends to happen. RTS games tend to bleed out slowly, rather than dying overnight, with the possible exception of Rise of Legends, the 2006 sequel to Rise of Nations. The reason for this is that shortly after the game was released, there was a tournament with a $100,000 prize pool, which was massive at the time. Opportunistic Age of Empires players I Am Grunt and Doubt came first and second respectively, and after the tournament ended, Rise of Legends essentially died overnight. But this is the exception rather than the rule. In order to explain what I perceive to be the rule, I'm going to start by talking about my experience with Total Annihilation, which in my opinion is the best RTS game that doesn't have age or craft in the title. But the story of Total Annihilation as a competitive game is a bit sad to me. TA was a game I'd always heard about, but I wasn't actually able to find a copy of it until around 2006, a year or so before Supreme Commander came out. Remember, this was before Amazon, so in those days you had to find a physical copy of the game in a physical store where you lived in order to play it. By the time I got the game, its competitive community was quite small. It was played on a private server called Warzone, and there were generally only 30 or 40 people online at a time, even during peak hours. I managed to befriend the number one player at the time, and he sort of took me under his wing and let me spectate his games versus other top players. This was around the time when I'd really started to branch out and play every RTS game I could find, and most of them didn't exactly impress me. I played all the Command & Conquer games, Battle for Middle-earth 2, Dawn of War, Company of Heroes, and Rise of Legends, to name a few, but none of them really did what I wanted an RTS game to do. But Total Annihilation was different. Despite being a very figured-out game that seemed to me to desperately need a patch, it was the only RTS game I'd encountered that seemed to approach Age of Empires and StarCraft in terms of difficulty, especially on the macro side of things. But after spectating a handful of matches on a variety of different maps, my new friend told me something that's always stuck with me. When I expressed interest in getting into Total Annihilation myself and trying to play competitively, he told me that I shouldn't bother, and should just play Supreme Commander when it comes out. He explained to me that everyone who's still playing TA is quite good, and that it would take me months and months to even take a game off of the weakest players still playing. I knew he was right, and did end up just waiting for Supreme Commander, which I personally found to be a disappointing game, but that's not the point. The point is that my friend really was right. TA's remaining players were quite good, and if I had chosen to get into the game, it would have been a long time before I would have been able to win a serious 1v1. I think this phenomenon is a common occurrence in the communities of lesser-known RTS games. I think something sort of strange happens to the average skill in online plays, and RTS games community shrinks to a certain level. Here's a graph that roughly represents what I think happens, and it sort of flies in the face of what I consider to be conventional wisdom. As a general trend, I think the average skill level of players in an RTS game goes up as the size of its community increases, but this seems to reverse when the average number of players online at a time dwindles down to the double digits. At least as far as I can tell, once a game reaches this level, it's basically impossible for it to recover, because any prospective new player will struggle to find anyone around their skill level to play with. By this point, the chance that such a player will persevere and keep playing the game until they reach a high enough skill level to compete with existing players is very, very low. The reason I say this flies in the face of conventional wisdom is that in general, I think an RTS game lives or dies by the sword of its competitive community. If a game doesn't have a core community of players trying to play the game as well as possible, it's probably not going to survive for long. But it also seems like a competitive community can't sustain itself without a steady stream of casual plebs. As a game is out for longer and longer, players get better and better at the game, and the barrier to entry for new players gets higher and higher until no new players want to take up the game anymore. But that's not all. I think there's another major factor that tends to accentuate this problem. For most of the history of RTS games, it's been pretty hard to set your game up to play online, and in some cases it's hard even to find the server that people play on. For example, when I first played StarCraft Brood War years ago, it was pretty easy to not know that Korean esports existed. If you bought a boxed copy of the StarCraft Battle Chest and hopped onto Battle.net, you were more than likely to form the perception that the game was dead competitively, and that everyone who was left over just played custom maps, and this was exactly what I thought at the time. I didn't know about IC Cup, and there wasn't much English language coverage of Korean esports at the time. And it isn't just StarCraft that's had this sort of problem. RTS developers are notoriously bad at supporting their own games beyond the first 6 months post-release. The online servers for most games end up being shut down a few years down the line, and whatever remains of the community generally has to create some kind of private server to play on, like for example Warzone, where I'd gone to play Total Annihilation, Voobly for Age of Empires, or CNCnet for Red Alert 2 and Zero Hour. Not only are these private servers difficult to find out about if you aren't in the know, they're also often quite difficult to get up and running. The third-party compatibility patches and private server clients are typically designed by amateur volunteers rather than professionals on a payroll, so you tend to get what you pay for. It's quite common to encounter installation errors and so on. For example, up until very recently, I struggled to get Voobly to work on my computer to play Age of Empires 2. With all these extra barriers to entry for new players in what is already the most difficult and demanding genre of game, it's no wonder so few players jump through all of these hoops and actually end up playing online. And if you're willing to persevere through all of this and become an active player, you're probably pretty hardcore. If you're not, you would have given up when you saw that the game's original servers were shut down, or when you encountered errors installing the private server client, or when you got your ass handed to you in your first 100 matches. On top of all of this, RTS games are almost always behind a paywall. How many young kids are really going to choose to play RTS games when they can play Fortnite for free? In many cases, you can't even try the game before buying it. Doom and gloom aside, I actually think there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about the future of the RTS genre, relatively speaking. Developers do seem to be starting to realize that people actually want to play these games if you make it easier for them. StarCraft Remastered and Age of Empires 2 HD Edition are doing very well. Online player numbers in StarCraft Remastered have exploded since the announcement of the Korea Star League, and Warcraft 3 is enjoying a nice little resurgence following the release of patch 1.29. I was, however, incredibly disappointed by Microsoft's decision to not only put Age of Empires Definitive Edition behind a paywall, but to make it a Windows 10 exclusive available only from the Windows Store. We can only assume that the same will be true for Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, and that in doing so, Microsoft will only exacerbate the very problem that AoE 2 Definitive Edition was supposed to fix. That is, to split the community again, as it is currently split between Voobly and Steam. The purpose of remastering a classic game should be to allow it to reach the largest audience it possibly can, not to dangle it in front of a pre-existing audience's face like candy to a baby in order to trick them into buying an operating system and making an account in an online store that they'll never use again. If they were smart, they'd put it on Steam again, like HD Edition, and have it be free to play with the game's original graphics, and have players pay for the graphical update, just like StarCraft Remastered. I guess this is sort of a messy solution since so many people have already paid for the HD Edition, so they'd have to give those people the graphical update for free or something like that. But at any rate, their current model will likely only serve to limit the popularity of what should otherwise be a blockbuster success, insofar as an RTS game can be. Given the success of StarCraft 2 since it went free to play, I would guess that this is probably the best way forward for RTS games. However, there's definitely room for experimenting with different free-to-play models. For example, developers could offer multiplayer with one of a game's playable factions for free, and then charge to unlock the others, as well as charging for the game's single-player campaign. I also think more RTS developers should be advertising tournaments like Blizzard does on the Battle.net app, or like Steam does within Age of Empires 2 HD Edition. I think it would also be nice to see developers start to advertise tutorial-type content for newer players. But while the lion's share of the onus is on the developers, I do think there are some things we can do as players to help the genre thrive. For one, we can be more helpful to new players trying to get into RTS games competitively. This is easier than ever, and plenty of people are already doing this. All of the games with sizable communities have YouTube tutorials and so on, but even on the individual level, we can all take time to help the random noobs we encounter in-game if they ask. Even more importantly, we should all be voting with our dollars. When a new RTS game comes out, buy it, even if it's not perfect. If we don't send developers the message that developing a new RTS game can be a profitable enterprise, eventually no one is going to do it anymore. On that note, there's a new RTS game called Bannermen that's coming out soon, and I was in its recent alpha. That's what the footage in the background of this video is from, in case you were wondering. Unfortunately, I forgot to record any footage of actual multiplayer matches, so this was just me trying to figure out a build order in single player. As you can see, it features a medieval semi-fantasy setting in a StarCraft-style 2 resource economy. I'm not sure how the company plans to monetize the game, but I can't encourage you all enough to support them. Even if it doesn't end up being the StarCraft or Age of Empires killer, which I'm absolutely sure it won't be, it would behoove us all not to bite the only hand that currently feeds. If you're waiting for Age of Empires 4, let this game be your aperitif. Personally, although I've enjoyed what I've played of Bannermen, I don't imagine I'll be playing it for years and years. But there's nothing quite like being on the ground floor when a new RTS comes out, and it's been too long. To summarize, the barrier to entry for new players in RTS games is quite high. And on some level, that's as it should be. RTS games are hard, and I think that's a large part of why most of us play them in the first place. But, while we don't want RTS games to be easy in terms of mechanical difficulty, we do want it to be as easy as possible for new players to hop online, hit find match, and start bonking some heads. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider rating, commenting, subscribing, or sharing. See you soon.